So those arriving, you're covered. You can say it to yourself as well. We've already said Motzi. But please come forward and sit up as close as possible, and we'll get started soon. My goal is for us to maximize the food for thought. We want to thank, from the outset, the Women of Reformed Judaism, Sharon Berman. I want to thank our program director, Jan Reisman, our executive director, Stacy Canales, and everyone who had a hand in this. Let's hear it for them. I think we do have, we're going to scooch in, we're going to be tight, but we do have room. So there are many seats up front.
I haven't figured out yet. I'll have to call them.
And Jan is not only a great co-worker, she's also a great Jewish mother. She said, don't forget to tell them there's dessert in the kitchen. So please, anytime you want, just walk in the kitchen.
If I should leave all my plants in my sunroom and it wouldn't have water, or should put them outside. It's a mistake. I put them outside and then I think we have snow. I didn't really put them in the word because it's that day on work. This is their but I've been trying to get my mix edging out some flowers. I had two of this plant about the summer Do you need to stay for something? Here. I'm not I know. Are you from Valley Road? Yeah. Well, you've been here. We got to go to Valley Road. Yes. What am and I see in the, oh yeah, I wouldn't come back here you go to I'm staying. No, I didn't come. I had to go. I visited somebody at the church, and I came home and rained. There you go. Are you coming to the dinner? Yeah. I know you won't. And if you didn't, can I do anything? Where have you been? I mailed my order to you today. Oh, thank you. Well, I just wanted to make here and look at the list. What a beautiful day. I'll have to take a word for it. You know what I meant? Look, see. I got stairs.
I haven't lived here long enough or have enough money.
Hi, I'm Stacy. Are you driving area? Listen, I was just saying I went for a run Hi. I just told you. You guys change clothes, yeah. This just went on your skin though. I don't know if you want to
Indian food. Yeah, go ahead. I already had a bite of the chicken fish. Let me just say, I'm wearing a dress up. Shop services. Well, I stay with shop services. I dress up on Fridays. Yeah, I've seen them. I'm excited for that. Sounds great. That's what I heard. I wasn't able to be here last night. Did you watch the game? It was awesome. I didn't watch the whole thing.
How could you? Oh, so you missed the beginning. I was gonna say, how could you turn it off? Okay. We're going on Saturday too. I'm so excited. My husband was there last night. I was like, just the two of us. Yeah. I'm so excited. I mean, it crosses all, lines of delineation here in our city.
So, Alana, does anybody need anything else? Anything else?
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to start. Is it a little too loud, AJ? Am I too loud? Thank you. That would help. Thank you. What a remarkable turnout. There's some more seats up here. One of our missions at Temple, since we can't bring Memphis to the rest of the Jewish world, one of my personal missions has always been to bring the best of the Jewish world to Memphis. And if you just read the local, whether it's the Hebrew Watchman or other wonderful things in the community, it's whoever comes. But it may not necessarily cover what you're about to hear. In fact, what you're about to hear, you probably wouldn't hear from any other Jewish speaker on Israel. And I can say that with good authority because he's my professor from the 80s. He was the professor to Rabbi Katie Bowman, Rabbi Adam Grossman, and Lauren Lusky, our Jewish educator. I didn't think, what year? 2007, and I was there in 1987. So the professor you're about to hear not only taught us at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, but if you were at Tel Aviv University in Middle Eastern Studies, or wanted to study issues related to women, not only in Israel, but in the Middle East, the professor beside me is the star. And so I didn't want to take up half of our hour eating. I wanted us to, excuse me? Oh, thank you. AJ's giving me a high sign. We're recording this, so if you could turn off cell phones, that'll help. And I know this sounds so, you're being so respectful and so reverent. Professor Paul Liptz is that rare professor who's an even better communicator. Last night, hopefully, if you follow your Temple emails, there will eventually be a link to last night's talk on the external threats to Israel. You could go to an AIPAC convention, you can go to a Federation speaker, and you wouldn't hear the talk you heard last night on the external threats to Israel from the inside of an Israeli. And today, we're in for a treat. I just want to also give you coming attractions. Tonight at 6:15, Professor Liptz will be giving the Devar Torah. it's not as comprehensive, of course, as this give and take, but we're honored that he will be the one speaking. Following, he's going to be speaking on Judaism in the Jewish state after services at a dinner here. If you're interested, ask my boss on this, Jan Reisman, and we'll see if we can find a place for you at the table. Sunday morning, at what time, Jan? 9:30. Since it's Yom HaShoah, what we often don't discuss is the Shoah through the landscape and people of Israel. How does the Shoah still inform? And again, I'm going to move out of the way right now and introduce to you Paul Liptz. Let's hear it for Professor Liptz.
Soren Tovim. Good afternoon. I've got an unusual accent. You thought I was going to come with a heavy Israeli accent. But I've tried to get over the last 47 years, but totally failed. Originally from Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, made Aliyah, I didn't realize, went to Israel one day before the Six-Day War. After 3 days, said it's a little bit better than the country I came from and stayed there. And I've had really, by anyone's kind of imagination, an unbelievable 47-year stretch in Israel. It's one of those countries where every other day is a surprise. And, you know, one craves for a bit of boring times, but probably isn't going to happen for another few generations. Today, what I'm speaking about is sometimes defined as gender studies, and I just want to describe how I got into this realm, although I don't particularly like the topic, the title Gender Studies, because issues related to women are all about the totality of society. It's not a separate discipline, it's about human beings. And many years ago, about 30 years ago at Tel Aviv University, I was looking at the curriculum, and I realized that one of my students in the course which I just completed, when we did the analysis of the course, and the students were very kind and very respectful, which is quite unusual for Israeli students. They probably thought because I come from an English-speaking colony, they have to treat me nicely. So they really were very nice. And one of the students, a female student, actually turned around at the end of the course and said, you know, your course on nationalism in the Middle East was so interesting. Thank you very much. But there was one word that I didn't hear, and that was women. And you know, we learn from our students more than our students learn from us. And I went home and I said, you know, that was such an unbelievably important comment that I then decided that I was going to develop a new realm, which was called, as Rabbi mentioned, Women in Arab Society. By the way, in the humanities in university, you have to be creative, because everyone's going to study business administration and medicine and law. So how do you get someone to study in the humanities? So I developed a course title, which was my one moment of brilliance in life, which was Women in Arab Society, Analysis of Movies. So a third of the campus wanted to study women. A third of the campus wanted to study Arab society. And a very large third wanted to watch movies. So I always had full classes. So it was absolutely wonderful. And as I was mentioning to Rabbi last night at dinner, the greatest problem I had in giving the course was actually on a tour that I had in the United States just before I started giving the course, when I went as a scholar to some small liberal colleges in the Midwest, and I went to the heads of women's studies programs. And I was about to give the course, so I wanted to get some interesting insights. And one of the women at one of the colleges, a very important expert on women's studies, listened to me and what I wanted to give and said the following, I never forget it: you have no right to give a course on women's studies. Obviously I was the wrong gender. And it struck me very, very strongly, and I felt a tremendous pain that she had claimed the topic for women only, and as I said in my introduction a few minutes ago, We're talking about the well-being of humanity. I'm going to try and present the topic of women in Israel in a slightly different prism. I was here 2 years ago, and I was asked to give a presentation on women from 3 sectors of Israeli society. But the prism I wanted to present today was something which is going to happen in Israel in about a week and a half's time. Every year in Israel, as you know, a young country, 66 years old, every year in Israel before Independence Day, before Yom Ha'atzmaut, at Erev Yom Ha'atzmaut, before Independence Day, just let me phrase the time, a week before Independence Day is Yom HaShoah, a Holocaust Day, which I'll be dealing with on Sunday, unbelievably powerful in Israel, for among many, many reasons that in 1952, 1 out of every 4 Israeli citizens was a Holocaust survivor. And we're not so far from the 1950s in Israel, so Holocaust for many, many reasons, Shoah for many reasons, is very powerful. And exactly a week later, we have Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day, for the soldiers who died in the various wars. And you can't be an Israeli without knowing some family where, unfortunately, tragically, someone has died. And I've had many students of mine from Tel Aviv University who I would teach and then come back to classes after a war, and they were no longer there. And immediately as you end Yom HaZikaron, at that moment, it is so powerful. You move from Yom HaZikaron to Yom Ha'atzmaut. And so the power of that hour is just more than one can imagine. And this year, at that very hour, there will be, as there's been every year, for 66 years now, a major, major ceremony, which is not only a ceremony which has importance in terms of being a ceremony, but it has a major educational role. And this year, lighting the 12 candles, the 12 tribes, which is such an important issue in terms of the wider Jewish people, will be 14 women. And that is the prism that I want to present today. I want to tell the story of the women. You have the page on your table. Sorry, the print is small. But I want to tell the story of the women in Israel through the stories of these 14 women. In 2 cases, 2 women will light the flame at the same time, as a way of talking about the challenges facing Israeli society. Let me declare my bias. The best teacher I've ever had in my life, and I've had wonderful teachers, Professor Yehuda Bauer, who's Israel's top expert on Holocaust study, would always start his lecture series at Yad Vashem, and I was a teacher at Yad Vashem for many occasions, and his first sentence was always the following: if anyone tells you they are unbiased, do not believe them. We're all biased. And I want to tell you my bias. My bias about Israel, the country that I love so much, feel for so passionately. I've always had 2 love affairs, my country and my wife, both of which I've had some disagreement with. But the country that I love so much is the country that I feel every moment that I live there is that I'm really part of the most dramatic moment of Jewish history. Now, I'm sure if Moses was around, he would be disagreeing with me. And he'll say, I gave you people the 10 Commandments, and what have you given us? So we still have to write our Israeli 10 Commandments. It might take some time. But it is really the feeling that I have in Israel that we're part of a story. We're in the middle of this most dramatic novel, but a real novel, a real story, which is being written by those of us who are involved and concerned, by the way, regardless of where we live. And therefore, the question of where women are in Israeli society has to be perceived not as, let's decide what the final statement is, but let us see which way the river is flowing. And the way a river flows, and for those of you who are interested in geography know that in desert areas, the rivers change the flow from season to season. And when there are heavy rains in Israel, the rivers of Israel through the desert and the way the desert looks after a major storm, positive rains, is one direction. And when it's been a dry year, the way that the river had been in the rainy season has followed another line. And that is what the state of Israel is about. From year to year, on absolutely every topic, the rivers have carved into the harsh Middle Eastern terrain a different direction. This year, the state of Israel decided that the flowing rivers will be the rivers of the voices of women. And that to me is a wonderful moment of Israeli history. Meriem Zohar, an actress in 1986, she got the Israel Prize for acting, comes from a painful Holocaust past. And the importance of Meriem is the question of what we do with our memory. Meriem came from this disastrous family experience in Transnistria, which is a country between Moldova and Ukraine. I've been to Transnistria, and the behavior of the Romanian fascists was just horrendous, had an unbelievable effect on Meriem. But Meriem took that tragedy of her family past to become an actor, actress, and a creator of passion and drama and story. And in Israeli society, when she, in a week and a half, stands up and lights the candle, the warmth of that candle that she is lighting will be a message to all Israelis of just how important culture is. You know, societies are made up of many, many different components. And I'm a great believer that only by understanding humanity in a very broad, holistic way can we understand what human beings are all about and what we should be all about. And Rabbi took me this morning to the renovated Museum for Civil Rights, and well, that speaks about the complexity of human beings and the struggles of human beings and the beauty that can even come out of very tragic situations. So when Meriem stands there, I hope that her flame says to Israeli society, at all times, however hard things are, and whatever other pressures we have, that we write and draw and create sculptures, and in that way we contribute to that vital component of human beings, which as I look around this room, is expressed in such a remarkable way. Kira Padinsky is a scientist. You know, Jews weren't considered so good at science for a long time, but Jews have always been good at science. Just 2 weeks ago, finished a 10-day tour in Spain, where I took the Leo Beck Temple group from Los Angeles, a group of 30 wonderful people, and looking at what Jews of Spain were in the 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries. I realized there was something very remarkable about Jewish scientists in Spain, and that was the combination and the ability of the Jews to draw from earlier Islamic cultures some of the wonders of scientific research. We didn't really start off in this project so early, but by the Middle Ages, you see that Jewish science is remarkable. And although I'm kind of somewhat reluctant to say what I'm going to say, because I only say it in very distinct circles, look at the Jews among the Nobel scientists, and the list is long. I want to say something totally irrelevant. but it's totally relevant. I've got a good friend of mine, a Palestinian academic, who has influenced me a great deal, because he always says the things that he feels. And we were once sitting down in a restaurant in Bethlehem, and he started off the conversation as follows. He said, "I've just seen a very disturbing email." And I said to him, "Adnan, what was so disturbing about the email?" He said it was a list of those who've received Nobel Prizes. Now, I've already got a well-prepared speech on how to deal with that terrible accusation. And it goes, wandering people through the desert, we couldn't plant anything in the land, so what could we take? Our cop, our hens. That's all we had. So I'm starting to give the story, and Adnan, who I respect very much, looks at me and says, no, Paul, you've got it wrong. You Jews are so wealthy, you have bribed all the Nobel Prize committees. And I kind of, you have to listen to people. But it was quite a shocking comment. No, Akira Pedinsky got it because she's just such a good scientist. She deals with futuristic ideas. She takes science, which seems to be such a definite realm, and goes into the unexplored. And Israeli science at the moment, I mean a per capita country, you know, we're a small country, 8 million people. Indian colleague of mine, I go off the point all the time because I really sort of studied Talmud, I think. An Indian colleague of mine once said he had just arrived in Israel, and he said to me, "Tell me, how many Jews are there in the world?" And I said, 14 million. So he said, you meant 140 million. So I said, no, 14 million. And then he said, and excuse me, trying to repeat an Indian accent, he said, "Oh, wow, 14 million. That's just a little neighborhood of Mumbai." I said, "Yes." And then he added something very significant. "But oh," he said, "you make a lot of noise." So, our little group of scientists have made a big noise in the world. The contribution of Israeli women, Israeli scientists generally, and certainly you find it increasingly in the Technion. All the figures, by the way, are showing that women are taking over academia in a very positive way in Israel. There are more, in many disciplines, there are more women in the PhD realms now than the men. So we're going to see more of the Kira Pedinskys in the future. These women contributing in vast realms to the ongoing growth of society, and she is described as one of the 35 top scientists in the world, which is quite an achievement. I want to say something about Israeli academia. You know, I looked at comparative budgets for research, and our Israeli budgets for research, for scientific research, is so much smaller than the equivalent scientist would get in the United States, in any of your good universities. So on limited budgets, those women who are at the top of Israeli science have had to be exceptionally creative, getting to where they got on budgets which are certainly a great deal less than an equivalent scientist in the state of Israel. Adina Bar Shalom is one of the unusual people to light the candle in Jerusalem a week and a half's time. You know, in the Reform movement, and I'm very active in the Reform movement, we often feel the underdog in Israel. And I'm going to speak more about it this evening. We have to realize that we have interesting colleagues within the religious world. Now, to describe Adina Bar Shalom as a potential colleague to the Reform movement would be a surprise to many people in Israel. Adina Bar Shalom is the daughter of the late Rabbi Avadia Yosef, one of the super ultra-Orthodox Sephardi rabbis. But Adina's story is fascinating. Coming from this highly conservative small C family, at the age of 14, she was removed from school by her parents. What did you need to educate a girl for? What was that good for? Coming from very traditional North African societies, the feeling in Israel until a very short time ago, really until a very short time ago, is that there was only one role for women in religious environments: leave school early. As will happen with Adina, she had to learn needlework because she was going to make some money for herself and the family by doing needlework, and that was it. Well, Adina Bar Shalom didn't want to go that route. And after a tremendous struggle against her late father and her brothers who have taken over the mantle of Sephardi ultra-Orthodox Judaism in Israel, Adina went off and said something is going wrong. And she essentially on her own has established a Haredi, an ultra-Orthodox college for men and women, which may be one of the most important long-term projects that Israeli society is involved in, a grassroots project, not coming from the corridors of power of the political elite, but rather by an activist woman, which is bringing the ultra-Orthodox world into modern education, to modern technology, to modern ideas. And if we're going to change anything in Israel, it's going to be by educating those people who until now have only been educated in their very specific ultra-Orthodox realm. She has brought modernity into their framework in a way, by the way, that no outsider could ever have done it. The fact that she's been allowed to not only educate men, which was a challenge in itself, but to educate women, which is a challenge in itself, and to educate them in the same building, means that if anyone who has the right to light the torch, it's Adina Bar Shalom. She is a friend of the Reform movement. She speaks to us. She speaks about us. And so sometimes when we look at the media and we kind of see Israel, the media in Israel is so much of this kind of a society which has fossilized itself. That isn't it. Because the Adinas and those kind of people who are very different from us, from people in the Reform movement, are out there and understanding and recognize that it's only by somehow being involved in combined projects, which is so much the philosophy for Women for Reform Judaism. My institute in Jerusalem has been gained tremendously from the funding of your organization and your concern of your organization. It's only by really getting together and going out of our defined frameworks that we can move forward. Carmela Menashe is probably Israel's most astute journalist on military affairs. Now, I thought military affairs was all about guys. No. Today, over 85% of all positions in the Israeli army are available to women. Now, just a little story about the women in the Israeli army, because I was personally involved in it some years ago. In the second part of my army career, I arrived in Israel when I was 22. So I didn't go through regular army, and I waited a few years and then did a shorter army service. But in my reserve army service, I had two positions. I was firstly a communications person when I was absolutely a disaster, and they were happy to remove me from the unit. And after the First Lebanon War, I asked to be moved to the education unit. And they thought that the damage I could do to the Israeli army would probably be limited. So they kind of moved me over to where my negative influence would be less so. And I had a most remarkable reserve army experience. It was unbelievable. I was a group of about a small unit of 10 people. Most of us were in academia. And every now and again, when the army had a problem that they thought that no one else could possibly want to deal with it, the 10 of us, or one of the 10 of us, would get the phone call. And I cannot tell you the kind of issues that we dealt with. Now, one of the issues was the following one. It relates very much to the army and to Carmela. In the Israeli army, there's a level called non-commissioned officers. It's the level between a regular soldier and regular officers. They're permanent army people who make the army run, but they don't quite have the talents to make them officers. So it's a very, very delicate sociological level of society where people are actually very important. Because without someone putting the petrol in the tank doesn't go. So they actually make the army run, but have sociological problems. And the Israeli army once got a late night call, and they said, come to the officer training. It was the officer training, a non-commissioned officer training base just on the outskirts of Jerusalem. And they gave me the following problem, which was very interesting. They said that what had happened in certain sections of Israeli society, that these young guys had gone into the army and they'd become non-commissioned officers fairly quickly, which gave them in their part of society high status. Now, I'm sorry to sound totally chauvinistic, but we're talking about a chauvinistic part of Israeli society. These young guys who looked as if they were going to be very successful turned around to the women of their society, 17, 18, and 19 years old, and these women were delighted to marry them because they were marrying successful husbands. 10 years later, those husbands are where they were 10 years earlier. And those young women who were so impressed with their husbands have had the first round of children and getting more and more into education, and are no longer impressed with their husbands. Now, this isn't just a problem of what's going on at home. This is a problem of national importance to the Israeli army. The Israeli army located thousands of discontented men. Now, why were the men discontented? Because the women 10 years earlier said, "You're great." And 10 years later, didn't have too much to say. So they called me in to solve the problem. It was quite a challenge. Well, I'd done some training in adult education, and I'd been around, and I'd sort of done a bit of chunks of psychology. And my solution was quite unusual, to put it mildly. I spoke to these guys, and I'd have these workshops of about 60, 70 guys, and I tried to locate what the real problem was, because I couldn't change their marriage. I mean, I didn't want to go them to divorce and find people who would be impressed with them for another 10 years. 10 years later, they'd be unimpressed again. I mean, what was I going to do? I couldn't do, my hands were held behind my back. But I listened to them. And in one discussion, in that moment, as so often happens, just came clear to me. One of the guys said to me, I was saying, "Why are you angry with your wives?" And one chap put up his hand and he said, "I want to tell you, my wife comes home in the evening. Firstly, she's not so keen on cooking anymore for me. And I work so hard during the day. And not only isn't she so keen to cook for me, but she goes off to a class on Shakespeare." So I didn't realize Shakespeare was the Hebrew for Shakespeare. So I'm kind of wondering, my Hebrew is fairly good. What didn't I learn about Shakespeare? Anyway, when I realized that the problem was the wife was going to Shakespeare, I had a wonderful, very simple suggestion. Why don't you go to Shakespeare with your wife? And he turned around and said, how can I? And I said, it's quite easy. Walk with her, go into the classroom, sit down, and you will be studying with your wife this amazing literature by Shakespeare. Now, we developed a program that was a bit more sophisticated than I'd set off on one leg, so to speak, but it actually was the solution. And the Israeli army developed over a period of time with experts in the particular field this realization that if we are going to succeed in Israel, we're going to have to deal with some of the gender intransigence which exists globally, not only in Israel, among men. And men are very conservative animals, to put it mildly, and to really try and blend it. So when Carmela Menashe lights the torch as an expert on Israeli military affairs, it is an indication to Israeli society that issues of the military are don't just belong to the males, but belong to all of us who live in Israel. And therefore, when I listen to her, and I'm often hearing her, she's doing sophisticated analysis of the structure of the army and strategic issues, and issues that we have to understand about our neighbors around us, to me that's a very, very important message. Just one very other short comment, because I really need about another 3 hours just to tell you some of the things that I want to tell you, but I'll speed it up. The question of women also, by the way, we wanted to get more women to become senior officers. The Israeli army opened the ranks for senior officers, and as I say today, 85% are open to women. It's a most remarkable army. There is actually no other army like that in the world, where women are increasingly getting to central positions. In the realm of women's activism, there's Hedinia Suleiman and Tali Peretz Cohen, an Arab woman who is involved in activism in a village up in the north, and Tali Peretz, who's head of the harassment center of the Galilee and the Golan. A comment on sexual harassment. It exists in Israel. It's a serious problem. It's a serious problem globally. The statistics show that sexual harassment is increasing. But as we all know about those kind of statistics, we're not sure that it's increasing, or women have become braver and are reporting to the authorities. And I feel that the second is absolutely correct. I think the fact that we are getting to the stage where the Israeli president was imprisoned because of sexual harassment, that senior ministers of the government have been removed from positions because of sexual harassment, that right through society there is a major attempt being made today to say this is unacceptable and there is no excuse, is important. And when those two women, one coming from Arab society, which has serious issues in those delicate gender roles, and a woman coming from the Jewish society, when those two women light the flame, it is a clear message to Israeli society that some of the things that tragically go on in societies are totally unacceptable. Geula Cohen stands there as a member of Knesset. She was a right-wing member of the Israeli underground. What's most interesting about Geula Cohen, she is on a weekly radio show with a very fine Israeli writer, Eli Amir, and they speak openly about the challenges facing Israeli society. And to have a woman who's as vocal as Beulah Cohen is, and I can't say I necessarily agree with all her political ideas, vocal, eloquent, clear-minded, and committed. She is well known to Israeli society as someone who stands up and speaks her mind, and that is what she will represent when she lights the candle. Gal Yosef, a 16-year-old, great for young people in Israel, the National Student and Youth Council head. Young Israeli women are outstanding, by the way. They are just amazing. 35 years of teaching at Tel Aviv University. I loved all my students. I had a particular love of the women students because they were so eloquent. They were so clear about themselves. They had such a sense of self-confidence. And it was just amazing learning from them as we went through the various courses in the academic realm of just who they were and what they'd come from. And many of them, by the way, came from families where their mothers were horrified that they were so self-confident. Remember, Israeli society, 85% of all Israelis come from totally non-democratic countries. And often non-democratic countries, as a definition, means countries where women have been seriously sublimated. So I was seeing the first generation of young Israeli women who had rejected what their mothers had wanted of them, which is some level of, keeping where they were and becoming just that much more creative. Jews haven't always been so good at sports, but thanks for Mark Spitz. Okay? It's a great moment. Sports is a comment of out there, in the front. It's been very problematic from a Jewish historical point of view because the circumcision of males in the earlier Greek periods of sport was very, very problematic. You may well know there was an awful operation of decircumcising the male, recircumcising, whatever that expression is, going back to the earlier situation before the circumcision, because in the open arenas when in the Greek period men used to run around naked, it wasn't possible for a Jew to be there. Those days are over. Israeli sports people are out there in the front. And it took a long time, by the way, before that arena moved from men to women and men. And at this particular situation, it is such, I'll be watching the program on TV, Shachar Pe'er, who's a well-known tennis player, she's the 11th top women's player in the world. She'll be lighting the candle with Pascal Berkowitz, who's originally from France, who as a young girl got her shoe caught on a railway line in France and her legs were cut off by a train. She is one of an amputee who wins as many prizes as you can imagine from her wheelchair. What she does now, she goes around the country lecturing on motivation. She's an expert on motivation, and if anyone has a symbol of motivation, she certainly does. Our fourth child has listened to her on many, many occasions. He's in the sports world as well. And this concept of how you can achieve goals, even when you have disability, is an extremely important message. Meriem Zohar, I know personally. She is the CEO of Intel Israel. Intel globally is a pretty impressive firm. Intel Israel is a particularly impressive firm. Meriem, who's originally from South Africa, has been defined by CNN as one of the most powerful women in the world of technology. She is really quite remarkable. The ability for women to be CEOs, we know it took a long time in America. It has been in many societies, the confines of a small number of men. The fact that women are in Israel right across the board. Go to the banks, the big corporations, the high-tech companies, wherever you are, filled with women today. Not on a one-to-one level. Still the glass ceiling is there, we can't deny it, but much better. Then there is Meriem Zohar, the mother of two sons who've been lost in the war. She's an amazing person. She speaks about living in Israel not as a country for the citizens of Israel, but a country for the wider Jewish people, if necessary. The 11th flame will be lit by the Israeli ambassador in Ethiopia, Belanish Zavadia, an Ethiopian woman who is Israel's ambassador. We ask ourselves so often, what is going to happen to the Ethiopian population? I cannot tell you that in the Ethiopian women's society, the need for role models is so unbelievably important. When I was in the army, we were at the very, very early stages of trying to get Ethiopian women to sign up for officers' course. Now, their parents were totally against it. So it was a long, long venture, and eventually we did get a few women in the officers' course, which was very important. But there's no doubt about it. To have an Ethiopian woman who goes back as Israel's ambassador to Ethiopia, that is a real achievement. And the last person is Orna Baravidia, who's a general. She has the second highest rank in the Israeli army. I've been giving the good news. We haven't finished the story. The lighting of the candles in a week and a half time is a powerful message to Israeli society, not so much in terms of what we have done, but what we have to do. And therefore, what makes me feel, and I could have given a different lecture, of where we haven't succeeded with Arab women. Only 28% of Arab women work in Israel, partly because the conservative nature of their male-dominated society doesn't allow them to go into the workplace, and unfortunately because of racism within Israel, which doesn't welcome them into the workplace. I could take sections of the Ethiopian society and show you the dropout rate. And until we get those people through school, and until we get more of them, particularly the women, into university, we won't have achieved what we want. And until we have a greater impact on the Haredi women's society.
Can you expand on that? The Haredi...
The Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox... the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox women group, whose average family size is 6.5 children. And I'm going to be very blunt. Until we can get those women to say to their husbands, enough, I'm sleeping in another bed. In Israel, in Hebrew, we would just say it somewhat differently. But we won't have achieved what we have to achieve. So the road is long. But at the age of 66, which in terms of statehood is just a few seconds, I think the success by many, many Israeli women is quite outstanding. But as I say, we haven't got there yet. Let me conclude with a quote that I saw at the Civil Rights Museum this morning by Lyndon Johnson. He said something which struck me very, very powerfully. As an Israeli, as a Jew, as a human. And he said, there are no problems we cannot solve together, and few that we can solve ourselves. So I come to you from the city of Jerusalem and say, let us do more together, regardless of where we live. Let women do more things with other women, and let men and women do more things with other men and women. And maybe somehow or other, in our lifetime, we'll really be able to say, and I believe it, we did make a difference. Thank you very much.
We're going to have time for questions. I realize some of you have to get back to work. I failed to say in introducing Professor Liptz that he has traveled, he's a scholar, been a scholar in 22 different countries he's spoken. And so we booked him a year ago, and we're just so honored that you're with us, thanks to the Burr Stern Fund. He flew here directly from Tel Aviv to Memphis. Last night he spoke from 3:30 in the morning to 5 in the morning, Israeli time. Here he was speaking on Israel's external threats last night from 7:30 to 9, and you would have thought it was 7:30 in the morning, but it was 3:30 in the morning. And we are so grateful to the Burr Stern Fund, but we're also grateful to you for filling this room. And hopefully you've never heard about these heroines in Israeli society who lift the torch 12 days from now. This is the type of modern Israeli issue that we would do well to learn about as we strengthen the connection and become one people. Questions for Paul, please, about any other aspect of women in Israel? Tonight we're going to, after services, we're going to talk about Judaism and the Jewish state, and of course Sunday morning on the Shoah. But please, anything you want to ask?
Anything at all.
Anything.
And you're allowed to disagree with me, but don't.
What is the status you're talking about, the ultra-Orthodox women and the men? I thought maybe they go to the army or something.
Yeah. You know, there are certainly attempts to bring the ultra-Orthodox men into the army. I want to tell you that the solution for the ultra-Orthodox is going to be the women. The men are not going to move. But I'm going to say something which is very mundane, and I hope it doesn't sound condescending, but it's actually true in the case of the ultra-Orthodox. The people who put the food on the table are the women. I have met ultra-Orthodox women, and in various situations, I've asked them very delicately, could you just tell me a little bit about your day-to-day life? What I wanted to know is how they deal with their husbands, but I phrased it somewhat differently. So after sort of playing around with a little bit of Israeli waltz, they would say to me, my husband knows absolutely nothing about what goes on at home. Leaves in the morning, goes off to pray and study, which are nice things, I'm not against it, but that's not what I'm doing all my time, some of it. I'm praying a lot actually, but I might be a different kind of praying. But they're out. And the burden on those women, with an average of 6.5 children, by the way, statistics are confusing. 6.5 children often means 12, 14, 16, 18 children that women by themselves are essentially bringing up. And the whole process of how it works is just unbelievable, because 8-year-old girls are mothers in waiting. And they bring up the little ones. I can't tell you, it's a study in itself. So the changes and the advances when the ultra-Orthodox society is going to come from the women. And Adina Bar Shalom, when she started opening these colleges, and now, by the way, they're opening in many other places. There's in Jerusalem, Bar Ilan University has opened a different campus for ultra-Orthodox women. As slowly we get these women into the workplace, and as slowly they earn the income which puts the bread on the table, slowly they will be saying to their husbands, you have to be more involved in what's going on. I cannot bear the burden all by myself. And that is going to be the real factor, in my opinion, of change. And I just want to make a global comment. I've been doing this women's studies stuff for a long time. In any society where you see deeply ingrained change, not superficial stuff, but the essence of society has changed, it has always been because of the women. They're talking about that in India, they're talking about Pakistan, they're talking about Bangladesh, they're talking about in all countries of Africa. Wherever we see these issues and wherever there has been improvement, it's been because of that. So the issue of the ultra-Orthodox, I think Israeli society is on the wrong track. We think that if we get 1,500 in the Israeli army, we've solved the issue. But them getting into the army is only one small component. It's how do we reach the women. By the way, it's very interesting. In the ultra-Orthodox Jewish society, the men are kind of very nice because they love their wives to work. 120% of their time they would want. In the Israeli Arab society, it's exactly the opposite. And the men don't want their wives to work, want to stay at home. So we've got two sensitive, vulnerable groups in Israeli society, both of which the changing of the women's reality will be to the collective advantage of everyone. And so this is where we're increasingly talking about that in Israel. We're very, very much aware of when I started doing this teaching some 30 years ago on women, and it was kind of a way out topic. It's such a general part of discussion in Israel amongst significant sections of society that I think it's encouraging. Once again, I always know change is slow.
Professor Liptz, could you add just a word on how, from your studies and interviews with Haredi women, how they're maintaining their sanity?
Okay. They're maintaining their sanity in a very interesting way. By, in Hebrew we call it achvat nashim, the coalition of women together. That means those women who on their own would be devastated because they're getting together in different kind of frameworks and talking about their collective problems, that is of tremendous, tremendous assistance to them. You remember these people live in very small regional areas, so you're within walking distance of so many other people. But it's been the strength of those women's, what we would call in the Western world, the women's NGO organization concept, which has been the most important. By the way, right through the Middle East, we find that when women are vulnerable, unfortunately, often their mothers aren't so very helpful. But if the fathers are helpful, then they go through immediate change. It's a whole very interesting situation. So, you know, every now and again, we're beginning to see that in Israeli society as well. The assistance is coming from the male, the fathers. But it really is women interdependence. We all know that. When women get together, they talk about the important things of life. When men get together, they talk about who should be the next president. But it is that conversation of reality, which women are so capable of carrying out, is one of the factors which keeps, in terms of your question, those ultra-Orthodox women who their daily life is just, it can be hell, quite honestly, but the women around them help each other. There is an unbelievable self-help phenomenon which exists in the ultra-Orthodox world. We've got a lot to learn from, by the way. I speak to some of these women, not because I'm critical, because I think we have things to learn from them.
I think you once told me that some of these women exercise, but they can't tell their husbands that they do. Is that true?
That's absolutely true. There's a gym just opposite Hebrew Union College in the IMCA building. It's fascinating. Where they come and, when women sign up for the gym, there's a form you fill in, and you fill out, you know, your name and age and things like that, and your address and your phone number. And they don't fill in the line of address and phone number. And so when the person who runs the gym is a personal friend of our family was telling the story, I said to her, but why don't they fill in the information? And they said, because those ultra-Orthodox women who come to the gym have never told their husbands. Their husbands have no idea what they're doing during the day and never asked. And there's a famous little anecdote that I was told by this friend of ours that, you know, in the gym there's a lot of great music. And one of the women was saying to another woman, the following, said, you know, the music that we hear at the gym is really problematic. So the other ultra-Orthodox woman said, what's problematic? She said, last week after the gym, I went home and I'm in the shower and I'm starting to hum. And my husband knocks on the door and says, where did you hear that music from? I said, oh, I must have been walking past a radio shop. What was it all about? But it is this unbelievable situation. And these women, ultra-Orthodox women, are finding these other women environment. It could be talking, but it could be sport. And you actually see, you know, we know that the sociology of sport is unbelievable. It breaks down so many barriers. And many of these women are actually now entering realms that one just wouldn't expect, and you see it. You can actually see very, very unusual places in Israel. And you go in and you think, well, the audience is going to be just, one of these Israeli audiences. And sitting there will be 5, 10, 15 ultra-Orthodox women. You never say, what are you doing here? Because you're so happy to see them. But they're picking up stuff. And it's this filtering system, which is actually much more effective than I think many of us, normally realize. So thank you for that wonderful question. Any others? Just maybe one last question. Are we doing okay on time? But maybe
One
just
more, and then I notice many of you have to go by.
Have to go, I understand that. But why are you working? I mean, just stick around and listen to me. I mean, I've just been saying it's a good thing, so just the last question. Yeah. Okay.
This list of 14 women lighting the candles at this very emotional time in Israel's history. Are people emotional about the fact that it's 14 women?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Every year when we have it, you see what the emotion is, the timing. You have, Yom HaShoah is the week behind you. Then you have Yom HaZikaron, and it's at the very second when you change from Memorial Day to Independence Day. So it has such a powerful significance. So one year, by the way, the people who lit the candles were immigrants from various countries. And suddenly, Israeli society, Israelis are wandering around, and suddenly you look at this program, and everyone watches the program on Erev Yom Ha'atzmaut, and then afterwards go out and knock those terrible things on people's heads and give them headache for a year. But that's called contribution to happiness. You listen, it's a great learning experience. And everyone writes about it. There are articles after articles which are already appearing in the Israeli press, and after the lighting there will be analysis after analysis on what goes on. So the educational impact is very, very important. So just as people learned that immigrants came from countries that they knew nothing about a few years ago, now this is a kind of, I would say it's almost the peak learning moment of Israeli society. And that's why it's just not an event, it's not a ceremony, but it's a deep philosophical statement about the society looking at itself. And that's what the moment is all about. And I think you was maybe just one last question, sorry.
Will we be able to watch that here?
I don't know if it's streaming live like this talk.
But whatever it is, I'm sure you can enjoy it. It'll be on YouTube afterwards. Yeah. It'll
The technical name for the ceremony would be Yom HaAtzmaut. What would it be called?
Erev Yom Ha'atzmaut. Hatekes Erev Yom Ha'atzmaut. It'll be the ceremony of Yom Ha'atzmaut. It'll definitely be on YouTube afterwards. So you'll be able to see it. It really is very, very interesting, by the way. Very powerful. It's beautifully done. Israeli society is not very organized, but this is kind of one moment where people almost stand in a straight line, but not totally. I would like to thank you very, very much, and Shabbat Shalom. Thank you so much.
There is dessert, I've been told again, and if you want to take some to go, and Professor Liptz will stay. Thanks again for coming. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
You'll have to wait till there's a lot. A lot of people, I think, would because of the game and because of the maybe as much as I try to